Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 17th of October. Today we have some updates, so let's start. If we're talking about the front lines are stable. The only interesting update that I would like to discuss with you that the Western Sources map decided to color the Belgorodsky district, this one. As you can see, there is another color, some kind of red-pink color that added to the map showing the Belgorodsky district. I don't know why did they do this, but anyway, maybe because of the fact that now we understand that there are some clashes along the front line, along the border, and that the Ukrainians, using their rockets and missiles, are trying to attack Belgorod, the capital of this region. As you know, a few days ago, they managed to destroy the oil depot in this area, and also they attacked and destroyed some energy facilities in this town. If we're talking about the front lines, I repeat myself, they are stable. The Russians reported that Ukrainians were trying to storm the Russian position in Kupiansk area. As you can see, there are a lot of icons showing that there were very heavy clashes along the front line. The Russians reported that they attacked the 14th and 92nd Mechanized Brigade that located in this area, and as a result of those attacks, the Ukrainians lost around 160 soldiers, around 7 armored vehicles and 2 artillery systems in this area. All Ukrainians attacked were defeated and they were forced to step back. If we are talking about Liman front line, there were no changes, nobody did any actions during the day. And if we are talking about, let's say, Lysychansk front line, the area between Seversk, Solidar, Lysychansk and this triangle, the Ukrainians did small recon and combat in direction from Strypovka. As you know, there are like very heavy clashes in this area. The Russians were storming Solidar, which since, I don't know, the May of this year, but they didn't achieve a lot of success. They just managed to take the small power and the small industrial zone, the Knauf plant in this area, and that's it. And the main problem for the Russians is a small village, Yakovlivka. This is the checkpoint where the Ukrainians have very nice fortifications, and if the Russians want to take control over Solidar, the best solution in this case is to attack Solidar from the north. But to do this, first they need to storm Yakovlivka, and Yakovlivka is a very powerful stronghold, and the Russians couldn't take this town. Today the Ukrainians from their side were trying to make some recon combat in this area. They sent some forces and they were defeated. And as a result of that attack, the Ukraine lost around 50 soldiers and something around 12 armored vehicles, including cars, regular trucks and so on. And this is very interesting because we understand that the Russians are storming Bakhmut. As you can see, the Russian source map has been updated. Now the map shows that the Russians are already in the town, in the south, in small suburbs by the name of Ivangrad in this area, and there are very heavy clashes in the city. The Russians are storming very slowly, of course. The same thing they are doing in this area on the Patrick Lumumba Street. It's like they're moving from the east over the central part of town, and also the Russians are trying to do something or to break the situation in Solidar. And this attack from Yakovlivka is very interesting, this recon combat, because as you know, Zelensky a few videos ago reported that the situation in Bakhmut is very critical, and 3 days in a row after that we got updates that Ukrainians were moving a lot of reinforcement in this area with one purpose: to stop the Russians. So I believe that attack from Yakovlivka wasn't just like something like, I don't know, unplanned. It was a recon combat, and the Ukrainians were trying to understand the real situation, the real Russian position in the area between Solidar, Novokamyanka, Strypovka, Volodymyrovka. Maybe the Ukrainians will try to attack the Russians from the bridgehead between Yakovlivka and Belogorovka in direction, let's say, of Pilipchatyne. So maybe they will try to cut the Russians in Pokrovskaya and Bakhmutskaya and Solidar from the main forces, and maybe they will try to make some local encirclement of the Russians, because I don't see any other reason why the Ukrainians could do this counter-offensive operation in direction from Yakovlivka to Novokamyanka. But let's see. If we are talking about Donetsk, we can see the same picture. Donetsk is under very heavy fire. The Ukrainians shelling this town using the Western weapon, 155 millimeters shells and HIMARS systems and so on. Civilians, there were some killed civilians during the day, a lot of wounded and so on, so the regular story. People in Donetsk are very tired, but they used to with this situation, because this situation started 8 years ago, and I believe that these people don't know when this situation is going to stop. But anyway, they're under such a fire for 8 years. If we're talking about any progress on the front line, we can say that there were no progress on the front line from Donetsk till the Zaporozhye area. It's like no changes. If we are talking about Zaporozhye, about our town Kamyanska, this is the only area that the Russians and Ukrainians can communicate on the ground. The Russians, and if the Ukrainians want to leave Zaporozhye region or Ukraine, this is the only area in the south where they can then cross, let's say, the border between Russia and Ukraine, and they can enter the south of Ukraine. And the same situation from the Russian side. If the Ukrainians from the south of Ukraine or from the territory that under Russian control wants to enter Ukraine, this is the only area where they can do this. And today there was some prisoners exchange. The formula was 110 the Russians prisoners of war for 110 Ukrainian prisoners of war. And today this action was pretty successful, and I believe that these people have already returned to their homes. If we are talking about Nikolaev Kherson front line, as you can see, there are a lot of icons. There were heavy clashes in this area. Mainly there was artillery duels. As you can see, there is a lot of icons showing that the Russians shut down some drones, Ukrainian drones in this area, that they shut down some HIMARS missiles, that they shut down 2 HARM rockets in this area as well. So the situation is very interesting. From the Ukrainian side, they were trying to storm town Bruskinska, this one. The Ukrainians need to take this town for one purpose, because we can say that there is a small bag from the Russian side, and if the Ukrainians are able to take Bruskinska, then they will be able to connect the Belogorovka-Andreevka bridgehead with this one, with the Ukrainian bridgehead in the recently liberated territories during the previous counteroffensive operation. So they just need this town to establish some stable connection between these two bridgeheads, because if we're talking about this bridgehead, the Ukrainians still have possibility to move their forces using the through the Ingulets River, but it's very dangerous, and the Russians attacking and bombing this area heavily. So that's why, of course, it will be much better if they're able to connect these two bridgeheads using the town Bruskinska through this area. And also, if the Ukrainians are able to take Bruskinska, of course, the Russians in this case will be forced to step back from Ishchenka, Sadok, Boroznenska, Petykhatka, step back towards more reliable positions like Shastleva, Staritsak. So they will have to step back for another 10 kilometers, and I believe that the Russians, of course, they don't want to do this. And if we're talking about the total losses during the day, the Ukrainians lost around 100 soldiers, 21 armored vehicles during the battle for Bruskinska. And that's it about the situation on the front lines. But now let's discuss about the main updates that starting this morning, the Russians attack the territory of Ukraine using drones, Shahid 136 or Gerain, how the Russian call this system, and Kalibr rockets and so on. As you can see, there are some icons all over the territory of Ukraine. If we're talking about Vinnytsia, as you can see, the Russians were trying to attack some energy facilities in this area, and as I know, they managed to destroy these energy facilities. If we're talking about Zhytomyr, there is an icon on the territory of Zhytomyr without any facilities or so on. So I believe that the Russians were trying to attack some military object in this area. If we are talking about Kiev, today we got a lot of updates, and as you can see, the Russians concentrated their attack in the central part of Kiev, and today their target was, let's say, the headquarters of all energy facilities in Ukraine. There is like a government organization in Ukraine that controls and that manipulates with the energy system of Ukraine. They receive information about the statuses, about the critical situation on the energy facilities all over the Ukraine. And in this center, the Ukrainians make a decision how to solve the issues, how to prevent the collapse of the energy system and so on. So the Russians were trying to hit this area. But there is another important building in this area. First one, as I told you, the headquarters of all energy facilities in Ukraine, and the second one is the boiler. This is like some kind of water boiler, and it's a very big boiler, and the Ukrainians using this boiler to, of course, to support the buildings and the town and the civilian buildings in this area. Using this boiler, the Ukrainians giving the hot water to the buildings. With help of this, they are able to support the normal level of the temperature in the residential area. So this is the second target that the Russians were trying to hit, and maybe they hit this area, and I believe that if they were able to made a lot of damage to this boiler, that means that this entire area this night are not going to have the hot and warm in their apartment. So let's see. If we are talking about Sumy and Chernigiv area, the Russians were attacking the same situations like in Sumy, the same energy facilities, as you can see, and they were pretty successful with that attack. And so on. So the Russians, the same situation in Dnipro, as you can see, another attack against energy facilities. So the Russians are trying to shut down the Ukrainian energy system as much as possible, and as you can see, their tactic is pretty successful, because we know that Ukrainians' any offensive operation ended somewhere at the end of September. 2 weeks passed since the previous offensive operation. As you can see, the Ukrainians do have army, they do have armored vehicles, they do have forces, they do have everything they need to start offensive operation, but they can't because of problems in energy facilities, because of problems in regrouping, in moving of fuel, in moving reserves, in using the railroads, and so on. Another important update about these attacks against the energy facilities. Today I had a conversation with some civilians from Kiev. I have friends in this town. We were talking about these attacks and so on. Of course, they are very scared. They are very angry at the Russians because of all these attacks, and we can understand them. But today, these people told me a very interesting situation. They told me that starting this month, starting these days, as soon as the Russians started shelling Kiev, and this is the capital of Ukraine, and civilians from this town became very angry at Zelensky. Very angry at Zelensky. Because you see that if we compare, let's say, Ukraine and Russia, we understand that if we compare these two countries, we understand that Ukraine is more democratic country than Russian Federation. Just for one reason, because if we're talking about Russia, we know that President of Russia, Putin, is the president since the 2000, so more than 22 years. There was like Medvedev and so on. But if we're talking about Ukraine, there were more than 5 presidents, I believe so. So at least we can say that Ukraine is more democratic country than the Russian Federation. And of course, I understand that Ukrainian authorities very depend on the opinion of the civilians. Very depend. And today I got a very interesting update from the Ukrainian authorities that after the Russian completed the shelling of Kiev, of the bombing of Kiev, they reported about the fact that soon they are going to show to people their own drone, by their own drone, Ukrainian drone, and the distance that Ukrainian drone are able to cross is around 1,000 kilometers. So let's say if we calculate the distance from the Ukrainian territory to Moscow, you see that if the Ukrainian drones are able to pass around 1,000 kilometers, so they will be able to attack even St. Petersburg, not just Moscow. Moscow is just 500 kilometers from Ukrainian border. So we understand that Ukrainians announced about creation of drones that are able to attack Moscow. This is the first update from the Ukrainian side. Another update about the kilos of the bomb that these drones are able to bring. If we're talking about the Russian Shahid or the Gerania, they call them, these drones are able to carry around 50 kilos of of the bomb. And as you see, the damage that these drones are able to do to Ukrainians, we saw the result of this attack. And the Ukrainian drones are able to bring 75 kilos, so it's like 50% more powerful bomb that the Russians are drone that the Russians uses right now on the territory of Ukraine. That was the report, and to tell the truth, I believe that was a big mistake from the Ukrainians, because you need to understand that the Ukrainian authorities announced about this drone not to scare the Russians or something like this. They report about such a drone to calm down the civilians. And I coming back to my story about talking with some people from Kiev. They are very, very angry at Zelensky, and they are very angry, and all of them are saying one thing. I'm not saying that like 100% of population are very angry at Zelensky, but a lot of people started to blame Zelensky because of the fact that he didn't comply with the Minsk II agreements. So as you know, in 2015 there was the second Minsk agreement. According to those agreements, the Ukraine should have done some adoptions in their laws about Donetsk People Republic, Lugansk People Republic, and so on. And the Ukrainians didn't do anything from those laws, from those agreements. And now a lot of people all over the Ukraine are angry at Zelensky because he didn't comply with those agreements. And this is very important because, as I told you in my previous videos, the Russians want to force Zelensky, Ukrainian authorities, to start negotiations. And the best situation to do this is to press and push the civilians, people all over the Ukraine, because of the fact that Ukraine is more democracy country than the Russian Federation. And if people in Ukraine will start some kind of strike, and they're able to do this, believe me, the Ukrainians will start negotiations. And these talks among civilians in Ukraine about these Minsk agreements is the first bell, because if the Russians continue their attacking, their shelling of energy facilities, energy system of Ukraine, that means that in a month they will start talking not about the Minsk agreement that they had like 8 years ago, but they will start, let's say, about 2021 or 2022, about the situation. Why didn't you liberate it? Why didn't you recognize Crimea as a part of Russia? Why didn't you recognize DPR and LPR as a part of Russia? Because all these lands are no longer the Ukrainians. Yes, of course, according to the map, according to their law, they still believe that these territories is theirs. But believe me, the people who live in Lugansk and Donetsk and Crimea, they don't think that they're the part of Ukraine. They don't think so. I'm not saying about 100%, of course. I believe that there are some percents, like 10, 20, maybe 30, even 40, I don't know, who still thinks and believes and wants to return to the territory of Ukraine. But the majority of the population, LPR and DPR and Crimea, don't want to return to Ukraine. They don't want to return to Ukraine. I'm not saying about Kherson, Zaporozhye. This is, like I said, the young Russian regions, and maybe people from these territories wants to return to Ukraine. But I believe that in a year or in two, even on these territories, people will change their minds and so on. So this is the Russian tactic, and they will continue shelling and attacking the energy facilities, boiler facilities, and any other structures that supply and supports the normal life of people, with one purpose: to make people more angry. And to force them to start some strikes, or we can say a coup or something like this, because as we understand, as we see, the Ukrainian military authorities are not planning to start any negotiations with the Russians, and their report about the drone is just a thing to calm down the Ukrainians. And another important thing from the people from Kiev that I talk about, the only thing that they're saying that now they're waiting for air defense systems. This is like the topic that they're discussing, that why nothing changes. They are talking that we are waiting for air defense system, but nobody knows when they're going to receive this air defense system, and nobody can tell if these air defense system are able to protect entire Ukraine, because most of the people in Kiev are saying that they believe that Kiev is under real protection, that the Russians are not able to attack Kiev anymore because of Kiev air defense system. But as we see today, as we saw the previous weeks, and as we saw yesterday, it's a fake. It's a fake, and the Russians are able to attack Kiev no matter any time, with any number, and at any time part of the day. They can attack this town easily without any problems. So this is the situation. Another important update are coming from Belarus. Today we got report that, and also there was videos of convoys of tanks, armored vehicles. According to the report we received from Ministry of Defense of Belarus, during this creating of this group on the south of Ukraine, the Russians are planning to move a lot of tanks, more than around 200 tanks, around 100 of artillery systems. But there is some tricky things you need to understand this situation. First of all, Belarus has a lot of tanks itself. As Ukraine had, as Belarus had almost the same number, thousands of tanks. So the thing is that Russian Federation moves some tanks. It's not a fake, but the thing is that but the difference between tanks in Belarus, in Ukraine, and Russia is that Belarus tanks are not modernized. And if we're talking about the Russians, of course, they managed to update their tanks, T-72, with a lot of updates, a lot of features, and so on. And of course, the tanks that were located in Belarus, they are not so updated. They're like old models without defense, without like navigation systems, and so on. So I believe that all these tanks, because a few weeks ago there was a video when the tanks from Belarus were moving to Russian Federation, and everybody was talking about that the Russians doesn't have any more tanks, so they're taking tanks from Belarus and so on. It's not like this. I believe that it was the same tanks that the Belarus moved their tanks for update, to modernize them, to make them more like modern and so on, and now they're receiving the updated tanks on the territory of Belarus. I'm not saying that the Russians or Belarus are not planning to use them in upcoming offensive operation in the south of Ukraine. I'm not talking about, but the things that we heard conversation today was just a conversation about the updated tanks that returned to the territory of Belarus. So, but anyway, we'll see what's going to be next. We'll see. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, and join my Patreon. And have a good day. Bye bye.